Welcome everybody, welcome to the Zoological Society of London and welcome to UCL lunch hour lectures on tour. It's very exciting. So I'm Kate Jones, I'm a Professor of Ecology and Evolution at UCL, and I also hold an honorary position here at the Institute of Zoology, so the Science Department of ZSL, and I'm going to be your host for this lunchtime. So firstly, thanks to ZSL for hosting us today. ZSL was founded in 1826 by Sir Stamford Raffles, and this organisation is an international scientific conservation education charity promoting global conservation of animals and their habitats. So I've got the immense pleasure of introducing two amazing speakers for this lunchtime. I'm really excited about this. So, Professor Steve Jones and Professor Helen Chatterjee from UCL. So Steve Jones is going to be talking about, is man just another animal? So that sounds amazing. He's an Emeritus Professor of Genetics at UCL. It tells me he's worked there for 40 years. He's an author of a heap of scientific books, with the most recent being No Need for Genius, Revolutionary Science in the Age of the Guillotine, which sounds fascinating. And he tells me his magnum opus is the Ladybird Book of Evolution. Steve says that he's one of the top 6 experts on the evolutionary genetics of snails, and he says the other 5 experts agree. All right, let's welcome to the stage Steve Jones.
So, is man just another animal? Well, as the French say, quand je dis l'homme, j'embrasse la femme. In other words, are men and women just other animals? Okay, well, this is the image I use to start my talk, and I'm doing it to schools, and I say, this is a picture of your biology teacher. And the students always laugh politely, but embarrassedly, but you don't have to laugh. However, the question about our relatedness to other primates was once a very controversial one. And it was noted, the similarity, of course, has been noted for many, many years. And it was noted in particular by this lady here. That's Queen Victoria, okay? She's the one on the left. And she came here to the Zoological Society of London in the 1830s. And she visited the orangutan, whose name was Jenny. And she noted in her diary that evening that the orangutan was frightfully and painfully and disagreeably human, okay? So she noted the obvious physical similarities between humans and primates. And this was well before, of course, the Darwin in 1859 had written The Origin of Species, but the idea of relatedness was definitely there. And of course, after The Origin in 1859 and after Descent of Man in 1871, it became extremely controversial. And in 1859, the magazine Punch, now extinct, thank God, as it was entirely unfunny, the magazine Punch published this cartoon, which is called Mr. Gorilla. And it shows what the nature of the controversy was about human versus primate evolution. And it shows this ultimate horror, maybe, of a gorilla dressed very formally in evening wear, asking a terrified human servant to introduce him to a grand banquet as Mr. Gorilla. And of course, this was a statement that what Darwin had done was to drag us down to the level of the apes, or perhaps more ingeniously, as in this diagram here, to drag us up, drag the apes up to our level. Okay. And that seems a somewhat ludicrous idea, but in fact, it's very much alive today. Here's a lady called Jane Goodall. She too is the one on the left, and she's doing the rather unwise act of kissing a chimpanzee. And Jane Goodall, as you probably know, is the woman who founded the study of the behavior of chimpanzees in the wild. And she spent most of her career in really very risky circumstances in different parts of Africa, studying chimpanzees in the wild. And she is an outstanding scientist. There's no question at all about that. However, Jane Goodall has become extremely attached, as you can see here, to her subjects. And she was one of the founders of an operation that's called the Great Ape Project. And the logic behind the Great Ape Project is that given that chimpanzees and humans, shall we say, share lots and lots of their DNA sequence in common, the figure that's around is 98.8%. That's a bit less than that. It's about 95%. Therefore, primates and chimpanzees in particular deserve some version, some diluted version of human rights. In particular, they deserve the right not to be experimented on in laboratories. Okay. Now, animal experimentation is a different case, is another question. But I have to say, I find that, and that idea has been successful if you think of it as a success, because in many parts of the world it is now forbidden to do animal experiments on chimps. Okay. Well, okay, but it seems to me absurd to argue from a sort of ultimate Linnaean kind of point of view that because humans and chimps share so much DNA that they're almost equal to each other. We share about 50% of our DNA with bananas, okay, and I don't feel a pang of guilt every time I have my breakfast muesli with a poor suffering banana sliced onto it. But you cannot, however, ask, what can biology tell us now about our similarities and our differences, physical, mental perhaps, possibly even moral, between ourselves and our closest relatives, chimpanzees most of all, okay? Well, there are very few, perhaps only one, famous scientist called Jones. Oh, there's two. There's another one here. Okay, right. Okay. And here's a gentleman called Sir William Jones. And Sir William Jones was an 18th century merchant. He went to school, not at the best school, Eton, but at the second best school, Harrow. And in the 18th century, what boys at Eton and Harrow did was to learn Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, okay? And William Jones did that. I imagine they still do speak fluent Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. I've never been to either of them. But William Jones did that and discovered he had a quite uncanny aptitude for languages. So he learned fluently Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and then he began to learn European languages, and by the time he was 21, he could effectively speak every European language. Actually, strangely enough, I once had a friend who was like that. He could speak so many languages, he could just pick up other ones by sort of bolting them together. But when he was a young man, he was sent, in his 20s, he was sent to India as a merchant, as part of the imperial sacking of Indian wealth. And he worked as a merchant and became quite wealthy. But he also worked on Indian languages and learned several of them. And he learned one in particular that was called Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is extinct as a spoken language, but it has a large literature. So he learned this, and he was astonished to find a similarity between certain words in Sanskrit, as we'll see in a moment, and European words. And it's worth reminding us of what, in the 18th century, and indeed later, the model of the origin of language was. It was a precise parallel to the creationist model of human evolution. The human sprang, fully formed, at one particular moment in history, and then Adam and Eve committed the first and perhaps least original of all sins and were chucked out of the Garden of Eden. Well, the question of language was the same. Man tried to build a tower, the Tower of Babel, that would reach to the heavens. God, who was a bit of a NIMBY, got very annoyed by this, and he thought, how am I going to stop man getting to the heavens? And he had a good idea. He invented language, because before that, everybody was spoken the same one, so that all the plumbers spoke Polish, all the bricklayers spoke Welsh, all the electricians spoke Chinese, and so on. And of course, they couldn't therefore build the Tower of Babel. So that was a creationist view of language, an exact parallel to the creationist view of evolution. And this is what William Jones found when he looked at these languages, that there were obvious parallels between words in English, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. These are just numbers, tu, duo, duo, and dva, and so on. And he thought, well, this is really strange. These languages must be related to each other. Okay? And what do we mean when we say that something is related, somebody is related to somebody else? We mean that they descend from a common ancestor. And William Jones wrote down the first ever evolutionary tree, which was the relatedness between words in the Romance languages of today, Italian, Spanish, French, and so on, for father, père, padre, pai, and the like. He could relate that to the Latin, pater, which is spoken, of course, at the root there, maybe 2,000 years before. That was very similar to the Sanskrit Peter, the Greek pater, and so on, quite different from languages like Eskimo. And he even had the idea of trying to reconstitute the extinct ancestor of that word. Sounded a bit like pater, okay? And that process has gone on now to such an extent that the ancestral language from which all these languages descend, Sanskrit included, Proto-Indo-European, or Pi as it's known, has been deciphered. People go to conferences and they speak Pi to each other, and you can even put dates on the dates these separated. Because, of course, we have fossils of language. They're called books, okay? They're called monuments, and they're called manuscripts. So you can date your books, your monuments, your manuscripts, and you can make what's called a glottolinguistic clock by saying, well, how far back can we trace this ancestry? People argue about this, but this is the kind of picture that arises. This is the split date. So as you can probably tell, I'm not speaking my first language at the moment because I was brought up until I was 8 speaking Welsh. So I've learned a little English now. I've forgotten nearly all my Welsh. So Welsh and split from the Germanic and Romance languages quite a while ago. You can go back to the Indian and the Iranian and the languages and the like. And you go back to Albanian, Greek and Armenian, even more distant, Tocharian, which was spoken in the Middle East and is now extinct, Hittite, ditto. And we can trace all the ancestry of all these languages, all of which are Proto-Indo-European languages, to about 9,000 years ago, which just by chance, or not by chance, is the date of the origin of agriculture, when there was a population explosion in the Middle East, and people began to move to the west towards Wales, and the east towards India, and indeed into China, speaking these languages. And what in fact happened, of course, was that as one generation succeeded the next, there were subtle changes, and the new languages evolved. They did it by a series of mistakes. And that's what evolution is, descent with modification, both for language and for genes. Okay. I mean, you could hear that today. If I listen to my UCL students now, they all tend to speak a bit like this, mate. That's even when they come from China. I'm quite impressed by it. But when I first came to UCL in the early 70s, they tended to be rather more polite and speak a little bit more like this. And so language has changed in that time. And if I were to come back in 100 years, which I think is probably unlikely, I probably wouldn't understand a word they're saying. It's getting to be a bit like that now, I have to say. So that's the language tree. So that's what evolution is. It's descent with modification. That's all it is. There's nothing magical about it. However, Darwin had another idea, which does not seem to apply to language, which has been described a bit over the top as being the best scientific idea anybody has ever had. And I think that's probably a bit of a mistake. But it's the idea of natural selection. What's natural selection? Inherited differences in the ability to reproduce. If you have a variant, a genetic variant, which makes it more likely that you will survive, find a mate, and reproduce, than individuals who don't have that variant, then that variant will spread, and in time, new forms of life will emerge. I often think of natural selection as a factory for making almost impossible things. The human eye is an almost impossible thing. And that's a standard creationist statement. Who could make an eye without a designer up there above the sky? Well, the answer is it's easy. And strangely enough, my own first experience or exposure to natural selection was in a factory. It wasn't a factory for almost impossible things. It was a soap factory on Liverpool's left bank, the Wirral Peninsula. And when I left school, I had the rather crazy idea of training to be an engineer. And I spent about 9 months in the factory there, and it's in many ways the best thing I've ever done. But I decided at the end of that this was too much like hard work, so I'd become a lazy academic instead, which I did. But in a soap factory, when you make soap powder, the way you do it then and now is to take a nozzle made of steel, stainless steel, about that long, and it's got, in my day, it looked like this. You pushed the liquid, boiling hot liquid in at one end. It came screaming out, a lot of noise at the other end, broke into a vapor and a powder, and the powder is what you want. You condense the vapor and use it again. Okay, so it's a simple idea. But in my day, these nozzles worked very badly. They used to get blocked. They wore out quickly, and so that the factory owners across the world hired intelligent designers, mathematicians and physicists, to try and improve the nozzle. Well, it didn't work very well, so they turned to a precise analogy of Darwinian natural selection. Inherited differences in the chances of reproduction. And what they did was to make 10 copies of this nozzle. Each one changed at random, longer or shorter, different position for the constriction, and maybe some marks on the inside. And they competed them against each other and against the original. And if one of them did a little bit better, they took that one and changed it 10 times at random and repeated the process again and again. And quite quickly, something remarkable began to happen. You began to get the evolution of an almost impossible nozzle. This worked 100 times better than anything that had gone before. We don't know why it works. No idea. We don't need to know why it works, but it does. And that's natural selection. And as we'll see in a moment, that applies to humans as much as it does to nozzles. And the classic example of natural selection in humans, as you probably know, has to do with skin color variation. And we're not like other primates because we vary greatly in our physical appearance across the world. Yes, we all know that, from very, very dark skins in the tropics to very, very pale skins in northwest Europe. Well, why is that? Well, there are clear geographical patterns, and we know a great deal about them. I took my vitamin D supplement about 3 hours ago, as I have done for some time now. It has to do with vitamin balance, because if you've got a dark skin, you can make less vitamin D in sunlight than if you've got a light skin. But the first question is, what about the genetics of skin color? Now, this is a classic of evolutionary thinking in genetics. Here at the top, we've got a fish that's called the zebrafish. For obvious reasons, it's got black stripes which are filled with black pigment called melanin. Okay? And this is widely used in developmental biology. We use it very extensively at UCL. Okay? About 20 years ago, a mutation, an error in this gene, in that pigment gene, appeared. It's called the golden zebra, and it's in the middle. And if you look at the little square, it doesn't have any melanin. Okay? And that's useful because it means you can see inside the fish more easily as it's developing. But once you've got this sequence from a zebrafish or anything else, you can search the human genome. You can do it from your home PC and ask, do we have this particular variant in the human genome? And the answer is yes. We have both the black variant, the zebrafish, and the gold variant. And if we draw a map of the two, we get quite a clear pattern. Just look at, for a moment, at Europe and Africa. And you'll see in Europe, almost everybody, native European, has got the light-colored version of the variant shown in yellow. Almost everybody in Africa has got the black-colored version. Now, of course, we're all Africans. Everybody in this room is a diminished African. We come from Africa. So the ancestral form was indeed dark, black, and we lost the color as we moved into Europe and also into China. But if you look across to China, you'll see, perhaps rather surprisingly, that actually Chinese people who are light-skinned tend to have the African version of the variant. And that's a classic of the way that evolution works. It doesn't think ahead. It's a series of successful mistakes. So natural selection is, and on the way to China, a different variant appeared compared to on the way to Europe. There's the Chinese variant of the gene. This is the one, a different skin color variant, so that white skin evolved twice. Okay? In fact, we now know about half a dozen various variants. And they evolved quickly, too. This is the frequency, rather boring series of figures here, from fossil DNA in the Ukraine. And in the middle, which is called MATP here, I'll just talk about that one, we've got the variants of the gene we've just been looking at, the zebrafish gene. The light-colored variant is at a frequency of 0 in Africa. In the modern Ukraine, where people are light-skinned, it's at a frequency of 93%. But 5,000 years ago, the frequency of that particular skin variant was only 43%. And 10,000 years ago, famously, there we have Cheddar Man, who was DNA was sequenced about a year ago, less than that now, less than a year ago. And he was, as a Brit, black only 10,000 years ago. And 10,000 years in evolutionary terms is effectively nothing. So what changed it? Well, it was indeed exposure to sunlight, because as we moved away from the sunlight of Africa, where you need to keep the sun's rays out to some degree because it destroys circulating vitamins, to the gloomy skies of the north, then it paid in individuals who had relatively light-colored skins were much better at soaking up sunlight and better, therefore, at making the vitamin D. And this is a diagram that shows the parts of the world where in the yellow you can make enough in all parts of the year. In the pale yellow, you can make at least 1 month a year when you can't make enough. And as I often say, if you draw a line through Birmingham, and many people wish to draw a line through Birmingham, and you go north of that, you cannot make enough vitamin D from sunlight alone to stay healthy. So why is it so important? Well, it was first found to be important in the bone disease rickets. And we know this used to be absolutely endemic in London until the 1930s. It's actually coming back now. That's a different story. It's a very damaging disease. It was known as the English disease because it was so common in England in the Middle Ages and indeed in the Industrial Revolution. And the Finsbury Health Centre, which is well worth going to in Finsbury, was set up specifically to treat children with rickets, and did so very, very successfully, and was in fact the founding stone of the National Health Service. And rickets gives you soft and damaged bones. But vitamin D we now does much, much more. And I'm not going to hark on about it, but it's very good. It fights back tuberculosis very effectively. It's very good on lung disease. It's good. It changes mood. Here comes the sun. Okay, and we all know how much you cheer up when the sun comes out. It's very good against Crohn's disease. It does amazing things. Really, buy the supplements. They're cheap. It's amazing. Okay, so that's why we evolved by natural selection light-coloured skins. There's one rather baffling, and there's the figures for African Europeans and American Europeans. Vitamin D levels throughout the year, and you can see the Europeans, dotted lines, have safe vitamin D levels through much of the year. You've got to be above 70 of these units. African Americans never have enough vitamin D. And many, many people today, many children today are vitamin D deficient because they don't go outside. Okay, you don't get much vitamin D from a computer screen. Okay, so that's natural selection. There are some mysteries in this story. What's the point of this mutant, for example? And there's Boris debating the Brexit in his characteristic way. And he's a blonde. And blondes are weird, right? Because blondes are only found in one part of the world. This is the frequency of the blonde variant. And that's for the same reason. Because as agriculture spread, bringing language with it, it got into Western Europe. And actually, in Western Europe, the early farmers could grow their porridge, and it was basically porridge, north of Birmingham and the like, because of the Gulf Stream. However, there was no sunshine at all there in the spring, okay, but it's warm, or it's raining. And therefore, blondes were invented, or appeared. We have Boris, and in the far west, redheads appeared. And we have those individuals too, for exactly the same reason, probably within the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. So nobody can deny that that there is natural selection in humans of just the same kind as there is in all other animals. So in that case, we are like other animals. But there are some subtle differences. There's the chimp. Chimpanzee genome has been sequenced. We know a lot about it. And there's a very strange picture that emerges, which is that actually, in many ways, chimpanzees have evolved by natural selection, whereas we have not. We have actually lost many of the attributes of the chimpanzee. There's a chimpanzee looking fierce and nasty and unpleasant, covered with thick black hair. If you look at the back of your hand, you will see that you're covered with fine downy hair. We have the same number of hair follicles as the chimp, but you've got little tiny pathetic examples of hair. Ditto the canine teeth. We have canines, but they're kind of pathetic. We found the gene involved that makes us bald. There it is. Mexican hairless dog, or Zolo, all right? The Aztecs used to breed them for hot water bottle use. They used to take them to bed, and they were hairless, and they warmed them up. And there we have the Mexican hairless dog and the horrible-looking Sphinx cat. And it's noticeable they have hair on the top of their head, okay? And that's the mutant which makes us bald, okay? There are other differences, too. I said it wasn't wise to kiss a chimp. Chimps are very, very strong, okay? And they also can be very vicious. And there are various cases of humans being mauled by chimps, and chimps certainly kill other primates. And the reason they're so strong is that we, compared to us, is that we have lost much of our muscular strength since our split from our common ancestor with the chimpanzee. There's the DNA sequence for myosin, a muscle protein, in several primates and a number of human groups, and you'll see 2 DNA letters missing. So we're feeble physically compared to chimpanzees. We're particularly feeble when it comes to our jaw muscles, okay? And if you look at any primate skull, you will see a large area marked in red, which is the attachment part of your jaw muscle. And what chimpanzees spend most of their day doing is chewing, okay? And they chew, of course, because they have a very, very non-nutritious diet. Here we have the joy of cooking. We have the standard American diet, basically bread, pasta, potato, and rice. Almost no vegetables, very little fruit, a great deal of meat, and the chimpanzee diet is totally different. It has vast quantities of dark leafy greens and fruit, and the greens in particular need a lot of chewing. Okay, so the chimpanzee spends its time chewing. Indeed, if you want to guarantee to lose weight, just eat raw food. We're the only animal that has ever evolved that cannot stay alive on raw food alone. If you decide to eat raw food, it doesn't matter what it is, you can eat as much as you like till you're blue in the face or green in the face of raw fish, of raw chicken, of raw potato, you will be dead within 6 months. You will have starved within 6 months. People do sell diets based on it. They're kind of risky diets, but you'll feel full because you're full of raw potato, but you will lose weight, and then in the end, you'll perish. So we need an external stomach, which is an amazing thing when you think about it. It's a deep fat fryer or a microwave in order to stay alive. If you look at our guts, indeed, they're tiny compared to the chimpanzee gut. A chimpanzee spends quite a lot of its time eating. The rest of its time, well, he spends quite a lot of his time having sex. Here we have another parallel, or perhaps non-parallel. There's Michelangelo's David on the left. David has a rather small penis, and that's because it was the custom in Greek statuary that having small penis was a sign of purity. However, if you look at the testes, they're of approximately correct dimensions. On the right, we have a rather gloomy-looking chimpanzee. If you look at the bottom of his portrait, I'm not quite sure what he's got to be gloomy about, okay? He's got enormous testes, and in fact, chimpanzees produce about 6 times as much sperm as men do, okay? And that's because there's a lot of sexual competition among chimpanzees. And quite recently, that's been shown to be even more striking difference. Here's a chimpanzee showing his talents, chimpanzee with an erection. If you look carefully at the organ involved, you'll see it's covered with spikes and spines. And there are an experiment's been done which shows why that is, which is that there is a male hormone receptor on the cells of the penis which picks up a message and grows the spikes. We, as humans, don't have it. It's the red triangle there, which is missing in humans. So we've even lost our penis spikes. Just terrible, really, isn't it? And indeed, if you look at across the whole human genome, compared to the chimpanzee genome and the inferred ancestral genome, what you find is vast quantities of deletions, bits missing in the human genome, which remain in the chimp genome. They're the blue lines here, and some of these deletions are huge, 25,000 DNA base pairs. So we are physically at least diminished chimpanzees. However, there is, of course, one organ which we are much better at, and that is, of course, the brain. And what's happened with us is that the site of human change has moved perhaps from body to mind. Okay, we don't need penis spines anymore. We have ways of decorating ourselves which are much cheaper than doing that, and looking after one's partner, which are much less painful than that. So we've gone from body to mind. And the effect is really quite striking. The size of the human cerebral cortex, the thinking bit, in terms of body mass, is 6 times bigger than that of the chimp. These are the number of millions of cortical neurons, nerve cells, lots of them in whales and elephants, but they're big animals, okay? Almost none in dogs. Dogs are thick. That's why they make good pets, all right? In chimps, about 6,200. And humans, twice as many, with many, many more connections. So that's really quite striking, okay? And what it's done is give us a new kind of mechanism of inheritance. I'm demonstrating it now, because we can pass on information not through the DNA alone, but we can pass it on through a uniquely human talent, which is language, okay? I once wrote a book called The Language of the Genes, based on that notion. And once you've got language, everything changes. You don't need to evolve in your body. And indeed, if you look at the human population genetics across the world, from Papua New Guinea to Iceland, we are the most boring primate of all. We're all the same. There's a difference, mild differences in skin color, but compared to chimpanzees, which are massively different from place to place, we're all the same. That's because we've evolved in our minds rather than in our bodies, as I say, through language. And you can see that in the case of people who have problems with language. If I'm turning muesli into hot air, as I am at the moment, with plus a few bananas, of course, as I'm turning muesli into hot air by speaking and using energy, part of the left side of my cortex, which is called Broca's area, shown in red here, lights up. Now, it's sometimes called the language center, and that's far too simple, because the whole brain is active, but it was particularly active in Broca's area. There is in West London a family, much discussed, who have a particular form of verbal inherited disorder, and there are several of those. So this is one of them that's called verbal dyspraxia. And what it sort of is an inability to deal with grammar. You can deal with nouns and verbs, but to the kids who've got this, to put it grossly oversimplified, the cat sat on the mat sounds the same as, means the same as the mat sat on the cat, which is bad luck for the cat, if they have a cat. And if you look at their brains when they're trying to speak, there's sort of chaotic activity across the whole brain surface. And you couldn't, because you can sequence this gene, which does many other things too, but you can sequence this gene, FOXP2, and you can draw an evolutionary tree of it in just the same way as William Jones had done with languages rather than language. And if you do that, you get a tree that looks like this. And when DNA changes, there are two kinds of change. There are called, some of which are rather misleadingly called silent changes, which make no difference to the proteins that are made, or they're made of other things too. And they're shown as blue dots here. And there are others which are coding changes, and they change the amino acids, the building blocks of the proteins. And you can see if we draw this tree based on the blue lines mainly, you can see that we fit exactly as you'd expect, close to chimpanzee, a bit less close to gorilla, and so on and so forth, much further away from mice. But there are two unique genes which are present, two unique variants which are present in humans alone. And it would be a mistake to call those the genes for language, but they're certainly involved in the origin and the evolution of the language process. And this is a unique event. This is a unique process. Okay? No other animal has language. Animals can communicate. If you kick a dog, it will yelp. All right, that's communication. But none of them have got a structured language in the way that we do. One of the most futile kinds of work that's gone on in primatology in the last 50 years is the attempt to teach chimpanzees to speak. Chimpanzees cannot speak. I mean, they don't have the right hyoid bone, but they can't teach them sign language. You can't teach them to put shapes together. Chimpanzees are fundamentally dumb in at least one sense. Okay, so that's the tree of language. The interesting question, that's maybe what gave us language. The interesting question is, of course, what about our distant ancestors? What about, for example, our friends the Neanderthals? Okay, there they are, much talked about. The gentleman in the back is one of my colleagues at UCL. I particularly use that diagram to emphasize the difference between modern humans and the ancient humans. Neanderthals had red hair. We know a lot about them. As you probably know, the Neanderthal genome is present in our own genomes. There are quite 1 or 2% of Neanderthal genes in our own genomes. And Neanderthals have got FOXP2. Now, humans have got lots of minor variants in FOXP2, so you can put these variants into a tree, and it turns out that we have variants, minor variants in this gene, which are only human, okay? And the evidence, some people dispute this, but I think that kind of evidence suggests quite strongly that Neanderthals did not have language. And that may well be why they went extinct so quickly, when speaking humans came in and shouted at them, and they went extinct. So what makes us, when we ask the final question, is man like other animals? Well, yes. But the essential point is that we have at least one unique attribute. Because language gives you everything else, a sense of history, a sense of the future, a sense of community. All these come from shared language. Okay? Now, evolution is no good at understanding unique attributes. So my father once told me a joke many years ago. He turns on a Welsh restaurant in Aberystwyth. Okay. In the 1950s, a Chinese restaurant opens in Aberystwyth, and a customer goes in and is served by a clearly Chinese waiter who speaks perfect Welsh. And the customer's amazed and beckons over the owner in Welsh and come and I'll translate for you. He says, "Well, boy, where'd you get this amazing chap? A Chinaman who can speak perfect Welsh." And the owner looks alarmed and says, "Oh, don't keep your voice down, boy. He thinks he's learned English." And of course, from a Chinese point of view, Welsh and English are the same language. They're little branches on the evolutionary tree of the Indo-European. From the English point of view, the various Chinese languages, and there are several of them, are the same language. But we can only say that because we know that we have languages across the world, we have fossils of language. So, in other words, I think we are like other animals, except in that crucial extent. Or to put that statement in other terms, evolution, biology will tell you everything you need to know about yourself, except for the interesting stuff. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Right, next speaker. 2 minutes too long.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was fascinating. So we're not going to have questions until right at the end, where we have a bit of a panel discussion. So I'm just going to welcome and introduce Helen, Helen Chatterjee. So Helen's going to be talking about Gibbonology, why study Southeast Asian apes. So Helen's a professor of biology at UCL. She's head of research and teaching at UCL Culture as well. Her research includes biodiversity conservation and evidencing the impact of natural and cultural participation in health. So Helen actually really loves gibbons, and these are small apes from Southeast Asia, and she's worked on them for over 20 years. And for 10 years, Helen's worked as a curator of the Grant Museum of Zoology, which many of you might have gone to. And she also chairs the National Alliance for Museums, Health and Wellbeing, and is advisor to the All-Parliamentary Panel on Arts and Health. So please welcome to the stage Professor Helen Chatterjee.
Hello everybody, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to ZSL for inviting me and UCL Lunch Hour Lectures on Tour. I think that's yours, Steve. So Steve's right, humans really are the most boring primate. That's of course because the most interesting group of primates is gibbons. So today we're going to mostly focus on gibbons from the perspective of them being an urgent conservation crisis. We'll talk a little bit about what a gibbon is, why they're an urgent conservation crisis. I'll talk a little bit about the sorts of research we've been doing to look at gibbons both in the past, what's happening to them now, and also thinking about what might happen to them in the future. So let's just start off by looking at gibbon diversity. So there's about 20 different species of gibbons distributed across Southeast Asia. They're split into 4 genera based on chromosome numbers. And those numbers are increasing as we understand more and more about them, both at a biological level, both at an ecological level, where they're distributed, and across Southeast Asia. But most predominantly, their facial markings. So I would disagree with Steve that humans have more facial variance than other primates, because actually primates have a lot of facial pelage differences. Their fur colour differs a lot across their face, according to species variation, and also different bits of their faces look different. So the pelage varies very distinctly. So we have, for example, some species with very distinct eyebrows, but like Steve, actually very attractive dark or white eyebrows, or cheek buffs at the side of their cheeks. And these features have been used to distinguish different species of gibbon, alongside a whole range of other, as well as genetic characteristics. And another key trait of gibbons is their singing voice. So people heard gibbons singing? Excellent. So gibbons have a vocal range that's the same as, or in some cases exceeds, humans. They have an amazing vocal range. It exceeds many opera singers. And these different vocalizations that they make, this singing that they make to communicate, to defend territories, to attract mates, is also species-specific. So we know a lot about gibbons. They're distributed across Southeast Asia, from South China right far across west to northern India, in Assam, in Burma, Bangladesh, down into Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, into Malaysia, across Sumatra, Borneo, Java. So they have a very wide distribution across Southeast Asia. The biggest issue with gibbons, as with many species of primates, is their conservation status. And alongside other apes and many other species of mammal, thanks to the great work, as Steve's already talked about, with Jane Goodall, we now recognise the really urgent conservation crisis for many of the world's mammals and indeed many of the world's species. And gibbons are particularly vulnerable to this for various reasons. What you can see from this chart here is all of those different species that I've talked about. All of those populations are decreasing and have been decreasing for a very long time. There's in fact only one species of gibbon where the population is stable, and I'll explain why it's stable. And several of those species are critically endangered, which means they're existing at very, very low population numbers. I'm sorry this is a little bit depressing, but there is going to be some fun gibbon stuff to come. So what do we mean when we're talking about very low population numbers? Well, as you can see from the figures here, we're really talking about very low numbers, so populations existing at very low numbers, which in some cases are really not viable. So what that means is even if those populations are reproducing, they're not doing so at a rate where those populations are increasing at significant rates. So you can see several species here that are highlighted in red. They're particularly urgent for us. We've got a new species that was named only last year, Huloktiangching, that's distributed in South China across Bangladesh and India. It's been discovered recently because it's been persisting in very, very fragmentary forests. Many of these species are living in fragmentary areas, so they're actually very hard to track. And we've also got two species that are already extinct regionally. That means they're extirpated from particular regions. So Hylobates lar on the left and Damascus leucogenes on the right are already regionally extinct in China. And that population that I talked about that's stable, it's critically endangered but it's stable, is Damascus hainanus. It lives in Hainan Island off China. The reason it's stable is that that population has persisted at numbers of between about 25 and 30 individuals for around about, as far as we know, 20 or 30 years. But as you can see from that number, 30 individuals, less than 30 individuals, is a very, very small number of individuals to exist. So this is why gibbons are an urgent conservation crisis. We have many species, but all of them, most of them are persisting at very low numbers. So what are the main threats to gibbons? Did anybody watch the Red Ape documentary on television the other week? Well, do look it up. It's on iPlayer. It's called The Red Ape. It covers lots of the points that I'm going to be talking about now. Gibbons, like many primates, and in fact like much biodiversity that persists in tropical and subtropical areas, are really threatened by habitat destruction. So those are the areas of high biodiversity that are being threatened by deforestation, the classic kind of slash and burn approach to land use, remodifying land use. A lot of that is due to agricultural expansion. The Red Ape documentary really highlighted the issues around oil palm plantations and the demand for palm oil, which is in basically most products that you are consuming, whether that's food products, whether that's toiletries, makeup. It's actually very hard now to find products that don't have palm oil in. And that's what the Red Ape documentary was about the other day. This is causing massive issues for these areas, because what we're talking about is the chopping down and the burning of huge areas of land, of pristine primary and secondary rainforest across predominantly areas like Southeast Asia, but also South and Central America. So primary rainforest that has supported extensive biodiversity for many, many thousands of years, chopped down in very, very quick, very short amounts of time, and also happening on a very, very large scale. So many hundreds of acres being destroyed at a time. Fire also, of course, has a big impact, not just for those animals that live in those habitats, but also for the non-human animals. They're threatened, and the humans are threatened. So we have really big health problems happening in these areas. So massive issues with respiratory diseases on the rise and respiratory-related illnesses. So there's a huge issue with human expansion and land use change. The other really big area for gibbons that's of concern is hunting and poaching. Gibbon products, all parts of gibbons, are used in traditional medicines, which is a major concern. So again, we can see hunters going into rainforests and extracting many, many hundreds of individuals at a time. So as you can see, when you're talking about very small population numbers, those sorts of impacts have quite drastic effects. And the other thing is, gibbons are really cute, and I'm not just saying that because I'm biased and I love gibbons, but they're really cute, so people like having them as pets, and they think they make really good pets. And as Steve has said, what we know is that actually non-human primates mostly make really terrible pets. Gibbons, like chimps, for example, have really big canines, and they're quite happy to use them if they're really annoyed with you. They also have really big territorial ranges. Gibbons love to move around. You can go and see some of the London Zoo's gibbons if you want to go and see Jimmy and Yoda after this. They'll show you how much they use their environment. They're moving around constantly. They have a really specialised form of arm-swinging locomotion called brachiation. And they're used to using the habitat at very high levels in the canopy and using it for many, many acres, many, many square kilometres at a time at very, very high speed. So putting an animal like that into a small cage to have it as a pet or to showcase it outside your restaurant or on a beach, to have your photo taken with it, again, has a very dramatic impact on that individual, but also creates a very big demand for those sorts of activities, both across Southeast Asia, but also increasingly in places like Africa and the US. So what can we do about this? So when I first started working on gibbons, we were a very small group, a clan of gibbonologists. We were about 10 of us across the world. In fact, so much so that my supervisor said to me, "Why do you want to work on gibbons?" But she allowed me to, thankfully. And since that time, that community of gibbonologists, both gibbon researchers, like myself, through to practitioners, professionals working in the field, running NGOs, charity organisations, supporting work on the ground, have got together to form a group as part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this is just what Russ Mittermeier, who's the Chief Exec of Conservation International, he set up an IUCN primate specialist group, and then he came to us a few years ago and said that gibbons are one of the most urgent conservation threats, and so we think you need to get together to form a specialist group. So we have, and we are the IUCN Gibbon Group, so please follow us. You can see our details here, and I will mention exciting things that you can get involved in towards the end of this talk. So this is just some of the kind of things that we do and why it's important to get international communities of researchers and practitioners together to focus on some of these urgent conservation crises. So the first is really strengthening the link. So a lot of the work that goes on, because of the nature of the habitats, they're very fragmentary, distributed across wide geographic areas. A lot of that activity tends to be quite fragmentary. So we're trying to be more coordinated with our conservation efforts, really trying to feed research into the development of practices and policies, whether it's thinking about things like translocation, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, through to then rehabilitation guidelines and those sorts of advice and links to how we might care for primates, in particular gibbons, better. And then a whole series of conservation action plans. So that's where individual species and individual population will have dedicated plans that are bespoke to the needs of that particular geographic area and that particular species. And also we try and provide technical support to all of those different conservation projects, because everybody's doing this work on very, very low budgets. And that's why the work that goes on in places like ZSL and the conservation projects that are linked to them is really, really important. So I'll just talk about some of that sort of research I was talking about, that how we can potentially feed gibbon research into gibbon practices and policy. So I'll talk about some of the research we've been doing around looking at how you can use species distribution modelling to look at individual species, both in the past, in the present, and also in the future. So one of the things we're interested in is how species ranges change over time and what those drivers are for those changes. So here's just a snapshot of one species of gibbon across time, both from the Miocene, from about 20-odd million years ago, through to the present day. And what we've done is break those data down into 3 time scales, a kind of fossil time period, a historical time period, so a more recent, through to the present day. And a lot of our work is really focused on collecting those sorts of data that can help us give indications as to exactly where species are now, have been in the past, and where they might be or might not be in the future. So what you can see here is, just from the past, so from about 20 million years ago through to today, that there's been generally a southward shift of this particular species, the crested gibbon. But actually we see that for many of the species of gibbon. We've seen a general southward shift of the distribution of those species. So then we can go back to environmental data and we can look at what those drivers are. And we know that there was a lot happening in the environment both 20 and 15 million years ago, an uplift of a big plateau in the Tibetan plateau across here, which is sort of slightly off the map to the north. That caused huge changes to the landscape, but also the climate. And then through to more recent times, through to the Pleistocene, so only about 100,000 years ago, where there was huge changes in the glacial maximums, which affected sea level changes. And that affected particularly areas like Southeast Asia, where we've got lots of small islands, which meant they were more interconnected. So that created things like land bridges, so populations could move around more easily and access areas that they hadn't accessed before. But then also they became restricted on those and isolated on those islands. So that's great. We can look at how things have changed over time and what those drivers are for those changes. But another thing that we're really interested in is what different sorts of data can tell you within the context of modelling. Modelling is, of course, just a way of guesstimating, estimating how changes have happened both now or in the past or in the future. And a lot of the sorts of work that people who work on different species of mammals in particular, what we're interested in is how ranges have changed over time. So the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, who collates the red list of endangered species, they will keep data from all different sorts of studies to create these range maps. I don't know how well you can see that, but what we've got is for here, for the crested gibbon, these areas in turquoise that are they're based on polygon data. That means they've drawn together lots of different information about where those species are distributed and suggested where they are on the map today. And this is it compared to the sorts of data that you can collect from other records. So that's both the sorts of records that go into the IUCN databases, but also individual studies. So where practitioners, researchers, field biologists are out there in the field and they've seen or heard a gibbon and they've collected GPS or other geographic coordinate data. So one of the things that we're interested in is really how distribution modelling can be used to use these different sorts of data, but also what kinds of variance you get when you look at different sorts of models. And one of the things that we're interested in is particularly how you can use that to forecast into the future. So we've been talking about hindcasting, but we can also use these methods to do forecasting. So we use various methods. The method I'm going to talk about today is using something called MaxEnt. And what this does is use a whole load of different environmental parameters called bioclimatic variables that are linked to, very broadly, where, in our particular case, primates are going to be distributed. So it includes things like precipitation and temperature. So what we can also do is use different climate models. So as you might know, there are different ways that different climate data is used to predict the climate in the future, but also what's happening today. There's many, many different ones, so we've just used a couple of global climate models. And as you may know, there's also different scenarios, different predictions for how the climate is going to change in the future. So the kind of worst case scenario, so each of these different climate models uses these different worst and best case scenarios. For example, a worst case scenario says that basically global temperatures are going to increase by 2 degrees and sea level, for example, is going to increase by 0.3 metres. And the best case scenario that everyone agrees on is that temperature will increase only by 1 degree and 0.24 metres of sea level rise. So what we can do is use, that's just two examples of climate scenarios that we can use, and that's estimating into 2050. So what we end up with is a lot of maps. We like producing maps in our group. We spend a lot of time looking at maps like this. And you don't have to worry too much about the detail of these maps. Hopefully you can see here the outline of Southeast Asia. Here's Borneo, and here's Sumatra, here's Java. And so what we're looking at here is areas of predicted suitable habitat based on those environmental data that we've just been talking about. And what we're really looking for in these maps is areas of red and orange and yellow, which, so the redder it is, the better that habitat is, the more suitable that habitat is for accommodating those species. So the first thing we can see, hopefully, is you can see that these are slightly different shapes. So these are different predictions based on the same input data using different models, and also using the different source data of the distribution data. So the first thing to notice is actually what we see is very small areas of optimal, pristine, ideal habitat that's suitable for these particular species to live in. So we've got some areas of yellow, which is moderate. You've got a little bit of area of orange there. That's the current day distribution, so the current day distribution of gibbons based on the input data using this model. And then this is a future prediction using the worst case scenario. So what we can see here that overall the area of green, kind of moderately suitable habitat, has kind of not changed massively, but what we've kind of lost is this optimal area. So gibbons are already, as you've heard, restricted in many areas. And so really what we're saying here is that it's kind of a double whammy for gibbons. They're really going to be affected by climate change, as well as all these other things that are already affecting them. And that's the case despite notwithstanding which input data you put in. So whether it's data that you've mined from museum records and other studies, or whether it's IUCN input data. And we can look at the same, even with the best case scenario. What you can see here again is general reductions of the quality of suitable habitat that's available if we project into the future. And again, what we can do is look at these different models. So this idea of using different models can give you different results, which is often some of the claims that are levied at, for example, climate change skeptics is, well, models show you different things. Well, of course, because they're just models and they're just suggestions for what might happen. But the point is that the input data that goes into them, what you hope is that that is reliable. And so, although we might see in these instances, for example, here's 2 different future scenarios using 2 different global climate models, and yes, they look different, but overall what they're predicting is that there's still a very, very limited area of suitable habitat. So what that shows is we've got some concordance between different sorts of models, whether it's a climate model or whether it's a prediction model, and also the fact that those areas are reducing over time if we project into 2050. And that's the same whether we're using a worst case scenario or a best case scenario. Still what we're seeing is reductions in the available habitat, suitable available habitat. So what can all that tell us? Well, what we know is that environmental drivers have pushed these species southwards, and that goes for many of the species of gibbons, not all of them. We see different shifts according to local drivers. But these shifts are not just as a result of, you've heard of these anthropogenic drivers like hunting, poaching, localised fire, habitat destruction, but also bigger environmental impacts that have been driving that distribution. So it's quite hard to predict how gibbons are going to respond exactly, but what we know is we can use these sorts of data to see, for example, here we've done some hindcasting using what we know about the fossil data, where it would predict we should be finding gibbons, but we know we're not, but also the actual distribution based on occurrence data, as you see, is quite different. So what we can do is use these data in different ways and play around with them to think about if we were and had the opportunity to translocate species, where would be the optimum place? Where are those ideal bits of red or orange? And I don't know, you probably can't see that here. It's very, very tiny, but there is actually an area here that is predicted to be more suitable. So those sorts of data can feed into conservation action plans and help us think about, if we do have the opportunity to think about translocation, and we want to plan long-term in the future, which many of us are advocating for, these are the sorts of things that we also need to consider, not just very, very local next 10 years, but also what's going to happen in 50 years' time. So the take-home messages for today. Well, sadly, 1 in 20, all but 1 in 20 species is declining, as you've seen, and we can use these sorts of models alongside all of the really, really valuable field data that we get from conservation biology studies to look at the present and future possibilities for gibbons. But we do see differences when we look at different data sources and climate scenarios. So we really need to have a more ensemble approach to thinking about how we tackle these issues. So we need to take all those factors into concern. And for gibbons, it really is a double whammy. It's not just these anthropogenic effects we've talked about, like local land clearances and hunting and poaching. There is also these significant climate change impacts, so we really need to think about that in conservation planning. And I promise you the fun stuff. So hearing about gibbons hopefully is great, and you've enjoyed it. We should have had more gibbon calls, I think. But we're also trying to raise awareness both across the ground locally in those areas that we work across Southeast Asia, but here in the West as well. And so to do that, we have an International Gibbon Day. I'm sure it's already in your diaries from last year. It's the 24th of October. So we have a whole series of events going on across the world, and it's everybody from local conservation organisations through to international conservation organisations, schools, outreach programmes, loads of different zoos get involved in activities. We always organise something at UCL and between ZSL and UCL, so please check our website, join us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter to find out what you're going to be doing on the 24th of October. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both speakers. So can I ask you both to come up and we can have a quick session to answer any questions you have. Steve?
Is it going to be in the exam?
No, that's a lecture. That's only at UCL students. Over here. Steve.
Oh, over here.
Everyone's very good.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes, first one over there. If you just wait for the roving mic. Very exciting, roving mic.
I was just going to shout. Steve, thank you for a hugely enjoyable talk. I have a question about your statement that other animals don't have language. You said at the end of your talk that language is necessary to appreciate the future. We know that some animals use tools, so they have an appreciation of the future consequence of their current act. So surely they must have some language, even if it's a basic form of language, but they don't have speech. So is there a differentiation to make between speech and language?
I think the difficult word is language. What do you mean by language? I mean, we all know what you mean by language. It's very hard to define what is a language and what isn't. There are big fat linguistics books I've tried to read and can't understand. But if you take tool use, for example, that information that is certainly passed down from one generation to the next, at least in some places, in some primates, in chimpanzees most of all. But the interesting thing is that apes ape, they don't teach. So what happens is, if you've got a chimpanzee mother who can use a big thorn to dig out ants or whatever you're talking about, or they can use a rock to bash open nuts, the chimpanzee young will look at that and will pick up the information, and you could call that a kind of a language. But what's very noticeable is that the adult doesn't care whether the young is there or not. They don't change their behavior the way when we're teaching people, particularly children, we change our behavior to interact with them and they will interact with us. And so that's a complicated learning process. Learning language being perhaps the most difficult thing we ever do. Whereas the ape approach is just simple static copying. And an awful lot of the supposed cultural heritage of different creatures. The whale songs come to mind, okay? Now, certainly whales do learn their pod's song, but if you follow that over many years, it changes. It makes mistakes happen, and it changes. And there doesn't seem to be any progress. They're just saying, we are here. So I think it's being a bit generous to call that a language.
At the back there, Robin.
Hi, Helen. To what extent, Helen, do you think that the current range of gibbons is constrained by environment rather than habitat loss?
Yeah, it is in the context of, but they're actually probably not living in their kind of optimal niche. They're probably almost, definitely, as we've seen, not living in their ancestral niche. And as you know, even those niches that they are living in are now suboptimal. So definitely they're not living in those realised niches, which is, I guess, a big part of the problem why populations are not doing that well, like the Hainan gibbon, because their diets are restricted. So we've started to see them to eat food products that you would never have guessed a gibbon would be eating, like going fishing.
Oh, that one first, and then the lady in yellow.
Thank you. Now, with such small populations of gibbons, is hybridization something you want to prevent? I mean, there have been sightings of hula gibbons, eastern and western, breeding and forming fertile offspring. Is that counterproductive in breeding out the species? And, sorry, that's it. Yeah, basically it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the whole issue of hybridization is an issue not just for primate species, but also people who work on birds, in that it really comes down to what is a species. So I'll let Steve tackle that question too. But in terms of it, is it a conservation barrier? It's not really, in the sense that I think for most of us, any population expansion is good if it's producing viable offspring. So it's only really a problem if you're obsessed with naming and taxonomy, which I'm not really. So.
Well, it's noticeable that if you look at the number of species in particular bird groups and in particular mammal groups, those which are most under threat have the most species. And that's because if you can name a particular island as having its own unique species, you get a grant to study it. Right? Isn't that true? There's a classic case in the US where they had two wolves, the red wolf and the grey wolf. Okay. Now, in fact, they're exactly the same damn wolf, but because the red wolf which had rather reddish pelage, was confined in a small area, lots of conservation work went in to save it. But all it is a tiny change in appearance. They're utterly interfertile. The DNA is the same. So the red wolf has been de-defined. It doesn't exist anymore. So that is a problem. But, I think it's completely overwhelmed by the much larger problem of keeping some gibbons alive somewhere.
And there is a drive to kind of have these, what are called genetic components for specific units, genetic units that could be used to define a species. So particularly in primatology, just because there's so many primatologists all over the world, so that you can more easily, if you are making a claim that's a species, then it has to meet certain criteria to be a good genetic species.
There's a question here, the lady in the yellow.
My question is also about language. You mentioned, I think, that Neanderthal man, he probably did not have language. How does the evolution of language relate to other characteristics which we regard as being human, such as the development of art or even the worship of a god or gods?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it's a good question. I mean, language and abstract thought tend to go very much together. You know, we can understand the past because we have the fossils of language, known as books, and language and some notion of an external agent greater than ourselves tends to go together. It's very hard. There are really, as far as I know, I'm no expert on religion, but one of the things which is striking about many religions is the enormous size of their written corpus, their willingness to talk about impossible questions. My favourite one being, you know, the question of the Holy Trinity. Is God three in one? Is it three individuals? That doesn't actually mean anything, but you can spend a whole lifetime writing and discussing that. And without a complicated system of language, I think that would never have emerged. I mean, I genuinely, I mean, people, there was a series on Neanderthals, just about finished now, I think, and I watched some of it. It was very good. And some people disagree. I mean, there's a bone in the throat called the hyoid, and chimpanzees have a form of a bone, of that bone, which means they find it very hard to articulate sounds, and they also have large tongues, so they would find it hard to articulate a sound. Whereas if you look at the Neanderthal hyoid, some people say it would make them possible to say ah, ee, ooh, ah, that kind of stuff, in a way that chimps can't. So the joy of these things, of course, is that Neanderthals are extinct, so we can try and reconstitute Neanderthalish, and nobody will ever know whether we're right or wrong.
Yes, in the middle there. Sorry for the person with the microphone.
Thank you for the talk. We think of Neanderthals as a different species, but my question is, how then could humans interbreed with Neanderthals?
So I didn't quite catch that.
If a Neanderthal is a different species from humans, how could they interbreed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question which is very close to what Helen was talking about. The messy, you know, Darwin's book is called The Origin of Species. It is not about the origin of species. It's about natural selection and all the evidence for evolution. And the nature of species, and I've seen this happen throughout my lengthy and undistinguished career, is that lifetime friendships have been broken on the definition of species. And it's very difficult to do. And what I often point out is that species and languages are very much like each other. There's a famous case in language across Europe from the east of Germany over to Holland, okay, and it's called the Rhenish Fan. And the Rhenish Fan is a series of dialects which move across. And if you've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on, in these Germanic dialects, A can understand B, B can understand C, C can understand D, so they can exchange information. But A cannot understand G, okay? And G is actually called West Frisian. And what's the famous phrase in English? Good bread and good cheese is in good Engels and good Fries. Good bread and good cheese is good English and good Frisian. Okay, and if you listen to Newcastle accent, the glot stop mate, and also in London, that is the end of the very end point of the Rhenish Fan. If you go to the west of England or Wales, you don't have this glot and stop mate. So, question is, which of those points is a language, and which of those points is a dialect? Well, because evolution is a continuous process, evolution creeps, it doesn't jerk. I mean, it doesn't jerk. Some of the people who study it may be, but evolution is generally a gradual process. It becomes, you know, angels on the head of a pin when you're asking about what is a species and what is a race, a word people sometimes use. So it's kind of a Holy Trinity question. It becomes unanswerable.
Paul there at the back.
A question for Steve. It's about sort of human evolution and the measure of it, that is IQ scores. Do you think IQ scores are a good measure of human cognitive function and intelligence? And also, do you think that we're still evolving? I mean, is there still room at the top for higher intelligence as an evolutionary trait in humans? I've read about the Flynn effect, where, you know, this is sort of slow rise in the average IQ scores over decades, put down to better diet, nutrition, and all the rest of it. But actually, that's a sort of a narrowing of the gap, if I understand it, and the sort of lower scores are increasing, but not necessarily the higher scores. So have we still got room at the top through evolution for human cognitive function, whether IQ is a good score or not, to measure it?
I have a whole lecture about this on my computer. I'll show you. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's an interesting issue. I mean, the problem with IQ scores, I mean, IQ is a variable as height is. Okay, you can measure it. It's not entirely clear what you're measuring with IQ, but it's the same is true with height. You've got a very crude measurement, just how many feet and inches you've got. It's got all kinds of attributes to it. And IQ scores, famous are or were notorious for their interaction with political views, claims of fraud, which are less clear than they once seemed. So I prefer to talk about height. Now I'm 1.7 meters tall, okay. And as Dylan Thomas once wrote a piece about himself, describing himself, he said he was of average height for Wales, that is, okay. Now, when I first came to UCL 44 years ago, God help me, I could still just about look the female students in the eye, okay? Well, now I can't even look the female students in the eye because their average height's probably about 1.8, 1.9 meters. In Holland, the mean height of young men has gone up in the past 40 years by 4 centimeters. Now, height is highly heritable, but people are getting bigger. So I think an awful lot of the change in IQ scores, a huge amount of it, is due to environmental change, to better schooling, to television, all these things that people decry. We have much richer intellectual lives than we did in the 1920s. And in some way, the genetic argument, I think, is irrelevant, because most human evolution is not genetic evolution.
Yes, over there again.
Sorry, another question about gibbons. They're often used as a model pair for monogamy, right? But as of late, there's been more and more observations of, for example, peletic gibbons showing polygynous structures, such as the one male and multiple female units, and Symphalangus and Dactylus siamanx showing a lot more serial monogamy instead of the lifelong ideal known of what monogamy is. What could this be down to, or is it just human interference and habitat destruction causing them to?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest challenge with looking at monogamy in gibbons. So traditionally, you're right, they were always listed as monogamous. And indeed, most families will still live in monogamous groups. Sometimes you see extra pair populations, but it is generally very rare compared to other primate species. But again, you're absolutely right. It's habitat fragmentation, which it now makes it more difficult for gibbons to live in these isolated family groups where they've got big enough territories to be able to have enough food to eat and move around in the way that they need to. So increasingly what's happening is family groups are living together. So in Hainan is the classic case where there's 2, possibly 3 big family groups. When I say big, I mean, we're talking, 10 individuals, but that's massive for a normal gibbon group that would be usually an adult pair with 1 or 2 offspring, depending on the offspring's age. So how much of that is due to, like you say, habitat fragmentation and recent changes is difficult to study because we don't know, for example, in the Hainan gibbon, what was happening before. So when Hainan was a pristine island full of lovely forest, the likelihood is they had ranges big enough to support individual family groups, but we obviously don't know. And there's probably some evidence that certainly some species are having extra pair activities, but I think, as I say, compared to other species of primates, it's probably fairly limited.
Thank you very much.
Yes, in the middle there.
Hi, I have another question about language. Amongst us lay people, there's the impression that researchers have successfully taught chimpanzees to sign. So if they don't understand language, what have the researchers actually done to create this impression?
Well, I mean, I'm by no means an expert on recent research in chimpanzee language, but I think, you know, there were huge amounts of effort was spent trying to teach them American Sign Language, for example. And my understanding is, at least from Steven Pinker's writings, is that basically it's very easy to delude yourself. You know, you can see, oh, look what he said dirty potty. But that he just put two random bits of information together. So you can point at individual cases where there has been some apparently grammatical statement, but you have to take the whole torrent of nonsense and ask what proportion of that actually makes sense. My understanding is, and like many things, you know, my understanding is limited, is that most of the classic attempts of the 1960s and 70s to teach apes either to put shapes together to make meaningful statements or to sign really have gone nowhere.
But it is true to say that what they can do, though, is they've learned to recognise a large spectrum of language, that words, or actually it's symbols that mean something.
Yeah.
So that is, you know, I can request a banana when I want it, or I know what to do. I can recognise different. So you could argue that's a language.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing that the creature which is good at that is the dog, and the dog is, you know, as I said, dogs are really thick. I mean, if you point at a dog, if you have a dog and you point, you've trained it, and you point over there, the dog will know there's some food there, and it'll go there and get it. Chimp won't do that. You know, this kind of interaction between individuals, one species and another, is quite complex. I mean, dogs have been selected to understand human language. You know, if you yell at a dog, the dog will know that you're really annoyed, and they will know it. Then they'll know their names. So you could argue that you need low intelligence to understand language, not the other way around.
I've actually got a question for you, Steve. So you talked about blondes and why we had blondes, but I wasn't quite sure why we had blondes. Can you explain that again? Because I'm intrigued by this thing.
As usual, I tried to put too much in. The origin of farming began something like 8,000, 9,000 years ago in the Middle East, and there was a population explosion that followed. However, the health of the farmers went down dramatically. If you look at the bones, you'll find all kinds of deficiency diseases and the like of early farmers, because they ate porridge. You know, it was Scotland in miniature. Okay, there was no sun, and they ate boiled oats. And I spent 10 years in Scotland, so I speak with some bitterness here. And the population, people spread, and they spread north, west, and so on. And as they spread northwards in most of Europe, they couldn't get above this famous line drawn through Birmingham, because in order for crops, primitive grains to grow, it has to be warm in the spring to germinate. Okay, so they got so far north and they couldn't get any further. But on the western edge of Europe, because of the Gulf Stream, the springs are warm, but there's no sun, because you've got cloud and rain. So that any further mutations in skin color that even further reduced or increased the amount of sunlight that could get in were favored. Hence the blonde, hence Boris. And even more strikingly, of course, is red hair. And red hair is right on the very edge of Europe. And if you look at the amount, real redheads can't tan. And they're sucking in huge amounts of vitamin D. So I think the picture is actually pretty clear.
That's really fascinating. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to draw the lunch hour lecture on tour to an end, and thank our speakers again for a fantastic set of talks, and for you to coming, and ZSL for hosting us. Thanks very much.